Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would be looking into Biographia Literaria and the other aspects related to chapter 4. Poetic theory in Biographia Literaria includes the most significant aspects of poetic theory of the Romantic period in the history of English literature. Some parts of the treatise appear as a response to the ideas of poetry jointly proposed by Coleridge and his close friend and collaborator William Wordsworth. Initially in the preface to their joint publication Lyrical Ballads in 1800, and then in the preface to Wordsworth's collected poems published in 1815. Referring to the latter, Coleridge says that his intention in the Biographia Literaria is to make clear, I quote, on what points I coincide with the opinions in that preface and in what points I altogether differ, unquote. This means that there were points of disagreements between Wordsworth and Coleridge. Biographia Literaria contains the earliest instance of the usage of the phrase suspension of disbelief. Commenting about his contribution to the Lyrical Ballads, which includes the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge says that although his characters were supernatural or at least romantic, he tried to give them a human interest and a semblance of disbelief.
Yet never a breeze up blew. The mariners all 'gan to work the ropes where they were wont to do. They raised their limbs like lifeless tools.
This would promote readers to the willing suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic faith. Edited by George Watson, Biographia Literaria is written from the perspective of the author Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Written in the first person point of view, Coleridge enunciates his own assessment of the relationship between literature and philosophy. The author, who is a poet and writer in his own right, presents his perspective, which is unique and original. Coleridge draws on the knowledge of philosophy to examine the functioning of the mind in his determination of the brilliance of the poet and the perception of the reader. In his observation of the essential elements of good poetry and the source of poetic genius, Coleridge quotes passages from different authors as he makes his points and explores the different aspects of the subjects he is referring to in the chapters. Let us now move on to the 24 sections of the Biographia Literaria as it exists in the present form. Note that the names of the chapters are taken verbatim from the primary text. The text is divided into two parts, 1 and 2. The chapters that are included in the first part are 1. The motives of the present work, reception of the author's first publication, the discipline of his taste at school, the effect of contemporary writers on youthful minds, Bowles' sonnets, comparison between the poets before and since Mr. Pope. Chapter 2, supposed irritability of men of genius, brought to the test of facts, causes and occasions of the charge, its injustice. Chapter 3, the author's obligations to critics and the probable occasion, the principles of modern criticism, and Mr. Sadeh's works and character. Chapter 4, which is considered to be very important, deals with the Lyrical Ballads with the preface included, Mr. Wordsworth's earlier poems, opinions related to fancy and imagination, and the investigation of the distinction important to fine arts. Chapter 5 is on the law of association, its history traced from Aristotle to Hartley. Chapter 6 includes the Hartley system, as it is different from the systems of Aristotle and not founded on facts. Chapter 7, the necessary consequences of Hartley's theory. Chapter 8, the system of dualism introduced by Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz. Chapter 9 is on philosophy, wherein he explains the science and its conditions, mainly relating to the philosophies of Immanuel Kant, Schelling, and the obligations Coleridge owes to them. Chapter 10 is digression and anecdotes as an interlude presiding that on the nature and genesis of the imagination or plastic power, and also an explication on pedantry. Chapter 11 is an affectionate exhortation to those who in early life feel themselves disposed to become authors. Chapter 12 is on requests and premonitions concerning the perusal or omission of the chapter that follows. Chapter 13 is considered to be another important chapter wherein Coleridge explicates on imagination, which he considers to be an exemplastic power. In part 2, he begins with chapter 14, wherein he tells us about the occasion that related to the lyrical ballads, the preface to the second edition, the causes for the preface, the acrimony, definitions of the poem and poetry with scholia. Chapter 15 deals with the specific symptoms of poetic power elucidated in the critical analysis of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. Chapter 16 explicates the points of difference between the poet of the present age and those of the 15th and 16th centuries, wherein he expresses the wish for the union of the characteristic merits of both. In chapter 17, Coleridge examines the tenets peculiar to Mr. Wordsworth, dealing with rustic life, formation of human diction with regard to Mr. Wordsworth, that poetry essentially is ideal and generic, and the language of Milton as a language of real life. Chapter 18, Coleridge expands language of metrical composition, why and wherein essentially different from that of prose, the origin and elements of meter, its necessary consequences, and the conditions thereby imposed on the metrical writer in the choice of his diction. Chapters 19 and 20, the subject continues with reference to Chaucer, Herbert, and others. Chapter 21 remarks on the present mode of bringing out critical journals. Chapter 22 is where he deals with the defects of Wordsworth's poetry in details, and the defects are written in comparison with the beauty of his poems. This means that Coleridge does not reject the beauty of the poems of Wordsworth, but he expresses his disagreement with Wordsworth on several occasions. And chapter 24 is the conclusion. We now move on to a brief summary of the 24 chapters before we deal with chapter 4 in detail. What exactly did Coleridge write in Biographia Literaria? Coleridge had long thought of writing about his examination of the connection between literature and philosophy. Biographia Literaria emerged as a result of Coleridge's conversation with his neighbor William Wordsworth. However, the book remained unpublished for almost 17 years. Coleridge provided ideas for the preface to the second edition of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, and this was then developed into the Biographia Literaria, which he had been wanting to write for a long time. Coleridge discusses the relationship of philosophy with poetry and the genius of the poet. Great writers of the age considered scholarship in philosophy to be important because philosophy was the sum of all knowledge. Coleridge examines issues like the use of language in poetry and how it relates to everyday speech, because the subject of poetry is inevitable to its relationship to everyday life. The brilliance of the poet is related to the source of poetic power that involves the employment of language, meter, rhyme, and the writing style of the poetic diction. The poet should write about themes that are not related to his own sensations and experiences, which is considered to be the origin of poetic genius. If the poet confines his poetry to subjects within his own experiences, then the work could be considered to be average. Coleridge believes that the primary function of poetry is to impart beauty and pleasure. Coleridge's critical acumen analyzed the works of other writers. Biography literaria incorporates many passages from various authors, and the literary output of Wordsworth and Shakespeare are elaborated. Coleridge not only examines the link between literature and philosophy, but also provides insights into the views of Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz, as well as other philosophers. He uses this approach to decipher the source of the poet's imagination. The brilliance of the poet is evident when the feelings of excitement and emotion are aroused in the reader, and Coleridge examines how this process functions and why some writers are more popular than the others. Coleridge also addresses the issue of literary critics who find something wrong with a literary work in order to sell reviews, some of whom he had problems with regarding his own works. He feels that many reviews are unfair and are the result of personal animosity. We shall now move on to chapter 4 of Biography Literaria, and the essay begins with Coleridge's defense of Wordsworth. At the beginning of the chapter, Coleridge refutes the criticism that he, along with Southey and Wordsworth, have founded a new school of poetry. This criticism, he believes, is entirely baseless. A careful examination of the 2 volumes of the lyrical ballads would reveal the fact that the omission of less than 100 lines from them would have precluded 9/10 of the criticism of his work. The few lines that offended the critics should have been regarded as mere inequalities and attributed to inattention, not to perversity of judgment. Men of business who pass their entire life in cities, and those who are pleased with that kind of poetry which is most distant from prose, would perhaps ignore Wordsworth's volumes altogether. Others, with a more catholic taste, would regard Wordsworth successful in respect of his style and subject. Some may like his poems with humbler themes written in a simple style. Some of the poems included in the lyrical ballads are written in plain and colloquial language, which critics fail to appreciate. They are not justified in denouncing the entire work merely on account of such criticisms. Let us now move on to some of the reasons for the resentment of Wordsworth by the critics. The true cause of the critics' hostility towards Wordsworth lies in the preface adjoined to the 2nd edition of the lyrical ballads. In the preface, Wordsworth explains his theory of poetic diction. Critics have cited his humbler passages to justify the rejection of his theory. Instead of establishing their judgment on his finer poems and real successes, they have based it on his comparative failures. In spite of their entire fault findings, it has to be admitted that Wordsworth possessed both genius and powerful intellect. The critics were uncertain about their estimate of Wordsworth and the accuracy of his theoretical propositions. This indecisiveness developed an irritation which found its expression in their critical estimate of the lyrical ballads. It is interesting to note that though critics are opposed to this collection, they differ from one another in their opinion about the individual poems included in it. If one cites a poem as appalling, another quotes it as his favorite. Therefore, every single poem in the collection is either extolled or considered to be unworthy, with the exception of those of the loftier kind which are enjoyed universally. As mentioned above, some of Wordsworth's poems have trivial themes and weak expression, and as such are unworthy of serious criticism. But the best part is that these poems have been the subject matter of criticism for nearly 20 years and the material for reviews, magazines and the like. Let us now move on to what Coleridge has to tell us about his acquaintance with Wordsworth. During the last year of his residence at Cambridge, Coleridge became familiar with Wordsworth's first publication entitled Descriptive Sketches, and he immediately recognized the emergence of an original poetic genius in Wordsworth. In form, style and manner of the whole poem, and in the structure of the particular lines and periods, there was acerbity combined with words and images. The language was not only peculiar and strong, but at times complicated and contorted as by its own impatient strength. The images used by Wordsworth in his poems were novel, and the style of writing was quite different from the predecessors. The combination of a unique style of writing and the novel imagery employed in his poetry demanded greater attention than the content. Let us now see what Coleridge has to tell us about Wordsworth's genius. With the development of a poet's genius, the faults and errors of his earlier compositions disappear. The same is the case with Wordsworth. His later poems are free from the drawbacks of his earlier poetic attempts. During his 24th year, Coleridge came to know Wordsworth personally. He remembers the effect produced on his mind by Wordsworth's recitation of a manuscript poem. Neither a strained thought, nor forced diction, or crowd or turbulence of imagery was evident. Reflections and human association gave both variety and added interest to natural objects. The occasional obscurities which had risen from the imperfect control over the resources of his native language had almost completely disappeared, and his compositions were devoid of arbitrary, illogical or fantastic expressions. What impressed Coleridge most in the poem that was rendered was a union of deep feeling with profound thought, the fine balance of truth with the imaginative faculty in modifying the object observed, and above all the original gift of spreading the tone, the atmosphere, and with it the depth and height of the ideal world around forms, including the situations and the incidents. The merit of a genius is so to present familiar objects as to rekindle in the minds of others a kindred feeling concerning them. Wordsworth was gifted with such a poetic capacity. Wordsworth succeeded in creating an element of novelty even in familiar objects. Let us now move on to some of the important quotes mentioned by Coleridge that relate to Wordsworth's genius. The character and privilege of genius, and one of the marks that distinguish genius from talents, the prime merit of genius, to represent familiar objects as to awaken in the minds of others a kindred feeling concerning them and a freshness of sensation. This quote tells us something about Wordsworth's genius as noticed by Coleridge. The next quote that we are going to see tells us how Wordsworth's genius produced such combinations, produced such poems that were mark of his genius. Genius produces the strongest impressions of novelty, while it rescues the most admitted truths from the impotence caused by the very circumstance of their universal admission." Unquote. Let us now move on to a recap of what we have done so far in this session. This chapter discusses Coleridge's relationship with Wordsworth and their publication of the lyrical ballads, which initiated the Romantic movement in England. While Coleridge accords the poetic genius of Wordsworth, he says that criticism of Wordsworth's poems would be entirely baseless if it rests on his alleged inability to appease the readers. Each individual has the peculiar ability to enjoy or dislike a poem according to his own taste. This fact should not undermine the exquisite quality of Wordsworth as a poet par excellence. Coleridge became familiar with Wordsworth's first publication entitled Descriptive Sketches and immediately recognized his genius and intellectual capacity. Wordsworth's use of plain language, the felicity of expression, and the representation of natural objects in his poetic collections prove his ingenuity. The confluence of profound feeling with thought, the use of imaginative faculty in modifying the object observed, and the unification of the situations and incidents render Wordsworth incomparable. So far, we have seen the contribution of Wordsworth as described by Coleridge. You would have a couple of questions to be answered that would enable you to understand this module better. Until we meet next time, this is me taking my time off.